Chapter 20. It was a minute before 3 when Dieter parked outside the Hotel Frankfurt. He hurried across the cobbled square to the cathedral, under the stony gaze of the carved angels in the buttresses. It was almost too much to hope that an allied agent would show up at the rendezvous the first day. On the other hand, if the invasion really were imminent, the Allies would be throwing in every last asset. He saw Mademoiselle Limes Simca Sink parked to one side of the square, which meant that Stephanie was already here. He was relieved to have arrived in time. If anything should go wrong, he would not want her to have to deal with it alone. He passed through the great west door into the cool gloom of the interior. He looked for Hans Hesse and saw him sitting in the back row of pews. They nodded briefly to one another, but did not speak. Right away, Dieter felt like a violator. The business he was engaged upon should not take place in this atmosphere. He was not very devout, less so than the average German, he thought, but he was certainly no unbeliever. He felt uncomfortable catching spies in a place that had been a holy sanctuary for hundreds of years. He shook off the feeling as superstitious. He crossed to the north side of the building and walked up the long north aisle, his footsteps ringing on the stone floor. When he reached the transept, he saw the gate, railing and steps leading down to the crypt, which was below the high altar. Stephanie was down there, he assumed, wearing one black shoe and one brown. From here he could see in both directions back the way he had come the length of the north aisle, and frowned around the curved ambulatory at the other end of the building. He knelt down and folded his hands in prayer. He said, "O Lord, forgive me for the suffering I inflict on my prisoners. You know I am trying my best to do my duty, and forgive me for my sin with Stephanie. I know it was wrong, but you made her so lovely that I can't resist the temptation. Watch over my dear Waltraud, and help her to care for Rudy and little Marcy, and protect them from the bombs of the RAF, and be with Field Marshal Rommel when the invasion comes, and give him the power to push the Allied invaders back into the sea. It's a short prayer to have so much in it, but you know that I have a lot to do right now. Amen." He looked around. There was no service going on, but a handful of people were scattered around the pews, in the side chapels, praying or just sitting quietly in the sacred stillness. A few tourists walked around the aisles, talking in hushed voices about the medieval architecture, bending their necks to peer up into the vastness of the vaulting. If an Allied agent showed up today, Dieter planned simply to watch and make sure nothing went wrong. Ideally, he would not have to do anything. Stephanie would talk to the agent, exchange passwords, and take him home to the Rue du Bois. After that, his plans were vaguer. Somehow, the agent would lead him to others. At some point, there would be a breakthrough, and unwise person would be found to have a written list of names and addresses. A wireless set and a code book would fall into Data's hands, or he would capture someone like Flick Claret, who would, under torture, betray half the French resistance. He checked his watch. It was 3:05. Probably no one would come today. He looked up. To his horror, he saw Willy Ribber. What the hell was he doing here? Ribber was in plain clothes, wearing his green tweed suit. With him was a younger Gestapo man in a check jacket. They were coming from the east end of the church, walking around the ambulatory toward Dieter. Though they had not seen him, they drew level with the crypt door and stopped. Dieter cursed under his breath. This could ruin everything. He almost hoped that no British agent would come today. Looking along the north aisle, he saw a young man carrying a small suitcase. Dieter narrowed his eyes. Most of the people in the church were older. The man was wearing a shabby blue suit of French cut, but he looked like a Viking, with red hair, blue eyes, and pale pink skin. It was a very English combination, but could also be German. At first glance, the young man might be an officer in the Mufti, seeing the sights, or even intending to pray. However, his behavior gave him away. He walked purposefully along the aisle, neither looking at the pillars like a tourist, nor taking a seat like a worshipper. Dieter's heart beat faster. An agent on the first day, and the bag he carried was almost certainly a suitcase radio. That meant he had a code book, too. This was more than Dieter had dared to hope for. But Ribber was here to mess everything up. The agent passed Dieter and slowed his walk, obviously looking for the crypt. Ribber saw the man, gave him a hard look, then turned and pretended to study the flitting on a column. Maybe it was going to be all right, Dieter thought. Ribber had done a stupid thing in common here, but perhaps he was just planning to observe. Surely he was not such an imbecile as to interfere. He could ruin a unique opportunity. The agent found the crypt gate and disappeared down the stone steps. Ribber looked across the north transept and gave a nod. Following his gaze, Dieter saw two more Gestapo men looking beneath the organ loft. That was a bad sign. Ribber did not need 4 men just to observe. Dieter would wondered if he had time to speak to Ribber, get him to call his men off, but Ribber would argue, and there would be a row, and then, as it turned out, there was no time. Almost immediately, Stephanie came up from the crypt with the agent right behind her. When she reached the top of the steps, she saw Ribber. A look of shock came over her face. She was disoriented by his unexpected presence, as if she had walked on stage and found herself in the wrong play. She stumbled, and the young agent caught her elbow and steadied her. She recovered her composure with characteristic speed and gave him a grateful smile. Well done, my girl, Deirdre thought. Then Rebbe stepped forward. No, Deirdre said involuntarily. No one heard him. Rebbe took the agent by the arm and said something. Deirdre's heart sank as he realized Rebbe was making an arrest. Stephanie backed away from the little tableau, looking bewildered. Deirdre got up and walked quickly toward the group. He could only think that Rebbe had decided to grab the glory by capturing an agent. It was insane but possible. Before Deirdre got close, the agent shook off Rebbe's hand and bolted. Rebbe's young companion in the check jacket reacted fast. He took 2 big strides after the agent flung himself forward in a flying tackle and threw his arms around the agent's knees. The agent stumbled, but he was moving strongly, and the Gestapo man could not hold him. The agent recovered his balance, straightened up, and ran on, still clutching his suitcase. The sudden running steps and the grunts made by both men sounded loud in the hushed cathedral, and everyone looked. The agent ran toward Deirdre. Deirdre saw what was going to happen and groaned. The second pair of Gestapo men stepped out of the north transept. The agent saw them and seemed to guess what they were, for he swerved left. But he was too late. One of the men stuck out a foot and tripped him. He fell headlong, his chunky body hitting the stone floor with a thwack. The suitcase went flying. Both Gestapo men jumped on him. Rebbe came running up, looking pleased. Shit, Deirdre said aloud, forgetting where he was. The mad fools were ruining everything. Maybe he could still save the situation. He reached into his jacket, drew his Walther P-38, thumbed the safety catch, and pointed it at the Gestapo men who were holding the agent down. Speaking French, he yelled at the top of his voice, "Get off him now, or I shoot." Reba said, "Major, I." Deirdre fired into the air. The report of the pistol crashed around the cathedral vaults. Drowning Rebbe's give away words. "Silence," Deirdre shouted in German. Rebbe looked scared and shut up. Deirdre poked the nose of the pistol hard into the face of one of the Gestapo men. Reverting to French, he screamed, "Off, off, get off him." With terrified faces, the 2 men stood up and backed away. Deirdre looked at Stephanie. Calling her by Mademoiselle Nimes' name, he shouted, "Jeanne, go, get away." Stephanie began to run. She circled wildly around the Gestapo men and dashed for the west door. The agent was scrambling to his feet. "Go with her. Go with her." Deirdre shouted at him, pointing. The man grabbed his suitcase and ran. vaulting over the backs of the wooden choir stalls, and hurrying down the middle of the nave. Weber and his 3 associates looked bemused. "Lie face down," Dieter ordered them. As they obeyed, he backed away, still threatening them with the gun. Then he turned and ran after Stephanie and the agent. As the other 2 fled through the doorway, Dieter stopped and spoke to Hans, who stood near the back of the church, looking stolid. "Talk to those damn fools," Dieter said breathlessly. "Explain what we are doing and make sure they don't follow us." He holstered the pistol and ran outside. The engine of the Simca was turning over. Dieter pushed the agent into the cramped back seat and got into the front passenger seat. Stephanie stamped on the pedal, and the little car shot out of the square like a champagne cork. As they raced along the street, Dieter turned and looked through the back window. "No one following," he said. "Slow down. We don't want to get stopped by a gendarme," the agent said in French. "I'm helicopter." What the hell happened in there? Dieter realized that helicopter must be a code name. He recalled that Gaston had told him Mademoiselle Lemus's code name. "This is Burgoyce," he said, indicating Stephanie. "And I'm Charlton," he improvised, thinking for some reason of the prison where the Marquis de Sade had been incarcerated. Burgoyce has become suspicious in the last few days that the cathedral rendezvous might be watched. So she asked me to come with her. I'm not part of the Bollinger Circuit. Burgoyce is a cutout." "Yes, I understand that. Anyway, we now know that the Gestapo had set a trap, and it's just fortunate that she had asked me to be there as backup for her." "You were brilliant," Helicopter said enthusiastically. "God, I was so scared. I thought I'd blown it on my first day." "You have," Dieter thought silently. It seemed to Dieter that he might have saved the situation. Helicopter now firmly believed that Dieter was a member of the resistance. Helicopter's French sounded perfect, but obviously he was not quite good enough to identify Dieter's slight accent. Was there anything else that might cause him to be suspicious? Perhaps later, when he thought things over. Dieter had stood up and said no, right at the start of the rumpus, but a plain no did not mean much. And anyway, he did not think anyone had heard him. Willy Reber had shouted "Major" in German at Dieter, and Dieter had fired his weapon to drown out any further indiscretion. Had Helicopter heard that one word, did he know what it meant? And would he remember it later and puzzle over it? No. Dieter decided if Helicopter had understood the word, he would have assumed Reber was addressing one of the other Gestapo men. They were all in plain clothes, so could be any rank. Helicopter would now trust Dieter in all things, being convinced Dieter had snatched him from the clutches of the Gestapo. Others might not be quite so easy to fool. The existence of a new resistance member, codenamed Charenton and recruited by Mademoiselle Limes would have to be plausibly explained, both to London and to the leader of the Bollinger Circuit, Michael Clariette. Both might ask questions and run checks. Dieter would just have to deal with them in due course. It was not possible to anticipate everything. He allowed himself a moment of triumph. He was one step closer to his goal of crippling the resistance in northern France. He had pulled it off despite the stupidity of the Gestapo, and it had been exhilarating. The challenge now was to make maximum use of Helicopter's trust. The agent must continue to operate believing himself unsuspected. That way he could lead Dieter to more agents, perhaps dozen more. But it was a subtle trick to pull off. They arrived at the Rue du Bois, and Stephanie drove into Mademoiselle Limes's garage. They entered the house by the back door and sat in the kitchen. Stephanie got a bottle of scotch from the cellar and poured them all a drink. Dieter was desperately anxious to confirm that Helicopter had a radio. He said, "You'd better send a message to London right away. I'm supposed to broadcast at 8 p.m. and received at 11. Dieter made a mental note. But you need to tell them as soon as possible that the cathedral rendezvous is compromised. We don't want them to send any more men there. And there could be someone else on his way tonight." "Oh my God, yes," the young man said. "I'll use the emergency frequency. You can set up your wireless right here in the kitchen." Helicopter lifted the heavy case onto the table and opened it. Dieter had a sigh of profound satisfaction. There it was. The interior of the case was divided into 4, 2 side compartments, and in the middle, one front and one back. Dieter could see immediately that the rear middle compartment contained the transmitter with the Morse key in the lower right-hand corner, and the front middle was the receiver, with a socket for headphones connections. The right side compartment was the power supply. The function of the left side compartment became clear when the agent lifted the lid to reveal a selection of accessories and spare parts. A power lead, adapters, area wire, connection cables, a headset, spare tubes, fuses, and a screwdriver. It was a neat, compact set. Dieter thought admiringly, the kind of thing the Germans would have made not at all what he would expect from the untidy British. He already knew Helicopter's times for transmission and reception. Now he had to learn the frequencies used, and most important, the code. Helicopter plugged a lead into the power socket. Dieter said, "I thought it was battery operated." "Battery or mains power. I believe the Gestapo's favorite trick, when they are trying to locate the source of an illicit radio transmission, is to switch off the town's electricity block by block until the broadcast is cut off." Dieter nodded. "Well, with this set, if you lose the house current, you will just have to reverse this plug and it switches to battery operation. Very good, Dieter. Dieter would pass that on to the Gestapo in case they did not already know. Helicopter plugged the power lead into an electrical outlet, then took the aerial wire and asked Stephanie to drape it over a tall cupboard. Dieter looked in the kitchen drawers and found a pencil and a scratch pad that Mademoiselle Lemus had probably used to make shopping lists. You can use this to encode your message, he said helpfully. First, I'd better figure out what to say. Helicopter scratched his head, then began to write in English. Arrived okay. Stopped crypt. Wander view. Unsafe. Stop snabbed by Gestapo but got away. Over. I suppose that's it for now, he said. Dieter said, we should give them a new rendezvous for future incomers. Say the Café de la Gare next to the railway station. Helicopter wrote it down. He took from the case a silk handkerchief, printed with a complex table showing letters in pairs. He also took out a pad of a dozen or so sheets of paper, printed with 5-letter nonsense words. Dieter recognized the makings of a one-time pad encryption system. It was unbreakable unless you had the pad. Over the words of his message, Helicopter wrote the 5-letter groups from the pad. Then he used the letters he had written to select transpositions from the silk handkerchief over the first 5 letters of arrived. He had written the first group from his one-time pad, which was BGKRU. The first letter B told him which column to use from the grid on the silk handkerchief. At the top of column B were the letters AE that told him to replace the A of arrived with the letter E. The code could not be broken in the usual way, because the next A would be represented not by E, but by some other letter. In fact, any letter could stand for any other letter, and the only way to decrypt the message was by using the pad with the 5-letter groups. Even if the codebreakers could get a hold of a coded message in its plain language or original, they could not use them to read another message, because the next message would be encoded with a different sheet from the pad, which was why it was called a one-time pad. Each sheet was used once, then burned. When he had encrypted his message, Helicopter flicked the on-off switch and turned a knob marked in English, Crystal Selector. Looking carefully, Dieter saw that the dial bore 3 faint markings in yellow wax crayon. Helicopter had mistrusted his memory and had marked his broadcast positions. The crystal he was using would be reserved for emergencies. Of the other 2, one would be for transmission and the other for reception. Finally he tuned in, and Dieter saw that the frequency dial was also marked with yellow crayon. Before sending his message, he checked in with the receiving station by setting HLCP DXDX QTC1 QRK?K. Dieter frowned, figuring the first group had to be the call sign helicopter. The next one, DXDX, was a mystery. The number 1 at the end of QTC1 suggested that this group meant something like, "I have one message to send you." The question mark at the end of QRK made him think this asked if he was being received loud and clear. K meant over. He knew that left the mysterious DXDX. He tried to guess. "Don't forget your security tag," he said. "I haven't," Helicopter said. "That must be DXDX," Dieter concluded. Helicopter turned to receive, and they all heard the Morse reply: HLCP QRK QRV K. Once again, the first group was Helicopter's call sign. The second group, QRK, had appeared in the original message. Without the question mark, it presumably meant, "I am receiving you loud and clear." He was not sure about QRV, but he guessed it must mean "go ahead." As Helicopter tapped out his message in Morse, Dieter watched, feeling elated. This was the spycatcher's dream. He had an agent in his hands, and the agent did not know he had been captured. When the message was sent, Helicopter shut down the radio quickly, because the Gestapo used radio direction finding equipment to track down spies. It was dangerous to operate a set for more than a few minutes. In England, the message had to be transcribed, decoded, and passed to Helicopter's controller, who might have to consult with others before replying, all of which could take several hours. So Helicopter would wait until the appointed hour for response. Now Dieter had to separate him from the wireless set, and more importantly, from his coding materials. "I presume you want to contact the Bollinger Circuit now," he said. "Yes, London needs to know how much of it is left. We'll put you in touch with Monette. That's the code name of the leader." He looked at his wristwatch and suffered a moment of sheer panic. It was a standard issue German army officer's watch, and if Helicopter recognized it, the game would be up. Trying to keep the tremor out of his voice, Dieter said, "We've got time. I'll drive you to his house." "Is it far?" Helicopter said eagerly. "Center of town." Monette, whose real name was Michael Clariette, would not be at home. He was no longer using the house. Dieter had checked. The neighbors claimed to have no idea where he was. Dieter was not surprised Monette had guessed that his name and address would be given away by one of his comrades under interrogation, and he had gone into hiding. Helicopter began to close up the radio. Dieter said, "Does that battery need recharging from time to time?" "Yes, in fact, they tell us to plug it in at every opportunity so that it's always fully charged." "So why don't you leave it where it is for now? We can come back for it later, by which time it will be charged. If anyone should come in should come in the meantime, but Grease can hide it away in a few seconds. Good idea. Then let's go. Dieter led the way to the garage and backed the Simca sink out. Then he said, "Wait here a minute. I have to tell Burgess something." He went back into the house. Stephanie was in the kitchen, staring at the suitcase radio on the kitchen table. Dieter took the one-time pad and the silk handkerchief from the accessories compartment. "How long will it take you to copy these?" he said. She made a face. "All those gibberish letters? At least an hour." "Do it as fast as you can, but don't make any mistakes. I'll keep him out for an hour and a half." He returned to the car and drove. Helicopter into the city center. Michael Clariet's home was a small, elegant townhouse near the cathedral. Dieter waited in the car while Helicopter went to the door. After a few minutes, the agent came back and said, "No answer." "You can try again in the morning," Dieter said. "Meanwhile, I know a bar used by the resistance. He knew no such thing. Let's go there and see if I recognize anyone." He parked near the station and picked a bar at random. The two of them sat drinking watery beer for an hour, then returned to the Rue du Bois. When they entered the kitchen, Stephanie gave Dieter a slight nod. He took it to mean she had succeeded in copying everything. "Now," Dieter said to Helicopter, "you would probably like a bath, having spent a night in the open. And you certainly should shave. I'll show you your room, and Burgess will run your bath." "How kind you are." Dieter put him in an attic room, the one farthest from the bathroom. As soon as he heard the man splashing in the bath, he went into the room and searched his clothes. Helicopter had a change of underwear and socks, all bearing the labels of French shops. In his jacket pockets were French cigarettes and matches, a handkerchief with a French label, and a wallet. In the wallet was a lot of cash, 500,000 francs, enough to buy a luxury car. If there had been any new cars for sale, the identity papers seemed impeccable, though they had to be forgeries. There was also a photograph. Dieter stared at it in surprise. It showed Flick Clariet. There was no mistake. It was the woman he had seen in the square at Sainte Cecile. Finding it was a wonderful piece of luck for Dieter, and a disaster for her. She was wearing a swimsuit that revealed muscular legs and sun-tanned arms. Beneath the costume she had neat breasts, a small waist, and delightfully rounded hips. There was a glimmer of moisture, either water or perspiration, at her throat, and she was looking into the camera with a faint smile. Behind her, and slightly out of focus, two young men in bathing trunks seemed about to dive into a river. The picture had obviously been taken at an innocent swimming party, but her semi-nakedness, the wetness at her throat, and the slight smile combined to make a picture that seemed sexually charged. Had it not been for the boys in the background, she might have been about to take the swimsuit off and reveal her body to the person behind the camera. That was how a woman smiled at her man when she wanted him to make love to her, Dieter thought. He could see why a young fellow would treasure the photo. Agents were not supposed to carry photos with them into enemy territory for very good reasons. Helicopter's passion for Flick, Clariette, might destroy her, and much of the French resistance too. Dieter slipped the photo into his pocket and left the room. All in all, he thought he had done a very good day's work. Chapter 21. Paul the Chancellor spent the day fighting the military bureaucracy, persuading, threatening, pleading, cajoling, and as a last resort, using the name of Monty. And in the end, he got a plane for the team's parachute training tomorrow. When he caught the train back to Hampshire, he found he was eager to see Flick again. He liked her a lot. She was smart, tough, and a pleasure to look at. He wished to hell she was single. On the train he read the war news in the paper. The long lull on the Eastern Front had been broken yesterday by a surprisingly powerful German attack in Romania. The continuing resilience of the Germans was formidable. They were in retreat everywhere, but they kept fighting back. The train was delayed, and he missed 6 o'clock dinner at the finishing school. After dinner, there was always another lecture. Then at 9, the students were free to relax for an hour or so before bed. Paul found most of the team gathered in the drawing room of the house, which had a bookcase, a cupboard full of games, a wireless set, and a half-size billiards table. He sat on the sofa beside Flick and said quietly, "How did it go today?" "Better than we had a right to expect," she said. "But everything is so compressed, I don't know how much they're going to remember when they're in the field. I guess anything is better than nothing." Percy Thright and Jelly were playing poker for pennies. Jelly was a real character, Paul thought. How could a professional safe-breaker consider herself a respectable English lady? "How was Jelly?" he asked Flick. "Not bad. She has more difficulty than the others with the physical training, but my goodness, she just grit her teeth and get on with it. And in the end, she did everything the youngsters did." Flick paused and frowned. Paul said, "What?" "Her hostility to Greta is a problem. It's not surprising that an English woman should hate Germans. It's illogical, though. Greta has suffered more from the Nazis than Jelly has." "Jelly doesn't know that. She knows that Greta's prepared to fight against the Nazis. People aren't logical about these things." "Too bloody right." Greta herself was talking to Denise. Or rather, Paul thought Denise was talking and Greta was listening. "My stepbrother, Lord of Fowls, pilots fighter bombers," he heard her say in her half-swallowed aristocratic accent. "He's been training to fly support missions for the invasion troops." Paul frowned. "Did you hear that?" he asked Flick. "Yes. Either she's making it up, or she's being dangerously indiscreet. He studied Denise. She was a raw-boned girl who always looked as if she had just been insulted. He did not think she was fantasizing. She doesn't seem the imaginative type, he said. I agree. I think she's giving away real secrets. I'd better arrange a little test tomorrow. Okay. Paul wanted to get Flick to himself so that they could talk more freely. Let's take a stroll around the garden, he said. They stepped outside. The air was warm, and there was an hour of daylight left. The house had a large garden, with several acres of lawn dotted with trees. Maud and Diana were sitting on a bench under a copper beech. Maud had flirted with Paul at first, but he had given her no encouragement, and she seemed to have given up. Now she was listening avidly to something. Diana was saying, looking into Diana's face with an attitude almost of adoration. I wonder what Diana's saying, Paul said. She's got Maud fascinated. Maud likes to hear about the places she's been, Flick said. The fashion shows, the balls, the ocean liners. Paul recalled that Maud had supervised him by asking whether the mission would take them to Paris. Maybe she wanted to go to America with me, he said. I noticed her making a play for you, Flick said. She's pretty. Not my type, though. Why not? Candidly, she's not smart enough. Good, Flick said. I'm glad. He raised an eyebrow at her. Why? I would have thought less of you otherwise. He thought this was a little condescending. I'm glad to have your approval, he said. Don't be ironic, she reminded him. I was paying you a compliment. He grinned. He could not help liking her, even when she was being high-handed. Then I'll quit while I'm ahead, he said. They passed close to the two women, and heard Diana say, So the Contessa said, Keep your painted claws off my husband. Then poured a glass of champagne over Jennifer's head, whereupon Jennifer pulled the Contessa's hair, and it came off in her hand because it was a rig. Maud laughed. I wish I'd been there, Paul said to Flick. They all seem to be making friends. I'm pleased. I need them to work as a team. The garden merged gradually with the forest, and they found themselves walking through woodland. It was only half light under the canopy of leaves. Why is it called the New Forest? Paul said. It looks old. Do you still expect English names to be logical? He laughed. I guess I don't. They walked in silence for a while. Paul felt quite romantic. He wanted to kiss her, but she was wearing a wedding ring. When I was 4 years old, I met the king, Flick said. The present king? No, his father, George V. He came to Summer's home. I was kept out of his way, of course, but he wandered into the kitchen garden on a Sunday morning and saw me. He said, Good morning, little girl. Are you ready for church? He was a small man, but he had a booming voice. What did you say? I said, Who are you? He replied, I'm the king. And then, according to family legend, I said, You can't be. You're not big enough. Fortunately, he laughed. Even as a child, you had no respect for authority, so it seems. Paul heard a low moan. Frowning, he looked towards the sound, and saw Ruby remain with Jim Caldwell, the firearms instructor. Ruby had her back to a tree, and Jim was embracing her. They were kissing passionately. Ruby moaned again. They were not just embracing, Paul realized, and he felt both embarrassed and aroused. Jim's hands were busy inside Ruby's blouse. Her skirt was up around her waist. Paul could see all of one brown leg and a thick patch of dark hair at her groin. The other leg was raised and bent at the knee, and Ruby's foot rested high on Jim's hip. The movements they were making together was unmistakable. Paul looked at Flick. She had seen the same thing. She stared for a moment, her expression showing shock and something else. Then she turned quickly away. Paul followed suit, and they went back the way they had come, walking as quietly as they could. When they were out of earshot, he said, "I'm terribly sorry about that." "Not your fault," she said. "Still, I'm sorry I led you that way." "I really don't mind. I never seen anyone doing that. It was rather sweet." Sweet? It was not the word he would have chosen. "You know you're kind of unpredictable. Have you only just noticed?" "Don't be ironic. I was paying you a compliment," he said, repeating her own words. She laughed. "Then I'll quit while I'm ahead." They emerged from the woods. Daylight was fading fast, and the blackout curtains were drawn in the house. Maud and Diana had gone from the seat under the copper beech. "Let's sit here for a minute," Paul said. He was in no hurry to go inside. Flick complied without speaking. He sat sideways, looking at her. She bore his scrutiny without comment, but she was thoughtful. He took her hand and stroked her fingers. She looked at him, her face unreadable, but she did not pull away her hand. He said, "I know I shouldn't, but I really want to kiss you." She made no reply, but continued to look at him with that enigmatic expression, half amused and half sad. He took silence for assent and kissed her. Her mouth was soft and moist. He closed his eyes, concentrating on the sensation. To his surprise, her lips parted, and he felt the tip of her tongue. He opened his mouth. He put his arms around her and pulled her to him, but she slipped out of his embrace and stood up. "Enough," she said. She turned away and walked toward the house. He watched her go in the fading light. Her small, neat body suddenly seemed the most desirable thing in the world. When she had disappeared inside, he followed. In the drawing room, Diana sat alone, smoking a cigarette, looking thoughtful. On impulse, Paul sat close to her and said, "You've known Flick since you were kids." Diana smiled with surprisingly warmth. "She's adorable, isn't she?" Paul did not want to give away too much of what was in his heart. "I like her a lot, and I wish I knew more about her." "She's always young for adventure," Diana said. "She loved those long trips we made to France every February. We would spend a night in Paris, then take the blue train all the way to Nice. One winter, my father decided to go to Morocco. I think it was the best time of Flick's life. She learned a few words of Arabic and talked to the merchants in the souks. We used to read the memoirs of those doughty Victorian lady explorers who traveled to the Middle East dressed as men. She got on well with your father? Better than I did. What's her husband like? All Flick's men are slightly exotic. At Oxford, her best friend was a Nepalese boy, Rahandra, which caused great consternation in the senior common room at St. Hilda's. I can tell you, though, I'm not sure she ever, misbehaved with him. A boy called Charlie Standish was desperately in love with her, but he was too boring for her. She fell for Michael because he's charming and foreign and clever, which is what she likes. Exotic, Paul repeated. Diana laughed. Don't worry, you'll do. You're American. You've only got 1.5 ears, and you're as smart as a whip. You're in with a chance at least. Paul stood up. The conversation was taking an uncomfortably intimate turn. I'll take that as a compliment, he said, with a smile. Good night. On his way upstairs, he passed Flick's room. There was a light under the door. He put on his pajamas and got into bed, but he lay awake. He was too excited and happy to sleep. He relived the kiss again and again. He wished he and Flick could be like Ruby and Jim, and give in to their desires shamelessly. Why not, he thought. Why the hell not? The house felt quiet. A few minutes after midnight, Paul got up. He went along the corridor to Flick's room. He tapped gently on the door and stepped inside. Hello, she said quietly. It's me. I know. She lay on her back in the single bed, her head propped up on 2 pillows. The curtains were drawn back, and moonlight came in at the small window. He could see quite clearly the straight line of her nose, and the chiseled chin that he had once thought not to be pretty. Now they seemed angelic. He knelt by the bed. The answer is no, she said. He took her hand and kissed her palm. Please, he said. No. He leaned over to kiss her, but she turned her head away. Just a kiss, he said. If I kiss you, I'll be lost. That pleased him. It told him she was feeling the same way he did. He kissed her here, then her forehead, and her cheek, but she kept her face averted. He kissed her shoulder through the cotton of her nightdress, then brushed his lips over her breast. You want to, he said. Out, she commanded. Don't say that. She turned to him. He bent his face to kiss her, but she put a finger on his lips, as if to hush him. Go, she said. I mean it. He looked at her lovely face in the moonlight. Her expression was set with determination. Although he hardly knew her, he understood that her will could not be overridden. Reluctantly, he stood up. He gave it one more try. Look, let's no more talk. Go. He turned away and left the room.